Marina Abramović is one of the most controversial contemporary artists thanks to the media attention in recent years, especially in the so-called truther community. Much has been made of her supposed ties to nefarious circles and evil practices. This video intends to look behind the works and the public persona and into her personality in order to find out what motivates her and how she navigates her life path according to classical Western astrology. Thomas Sheridan has made some very interesting observations about Marina Abramović, see the links in the pinned comment below, that I find reflected in the astrology, so he was pretty much spot on. The massive presence of planets in her fifth house is extremely fitting. The fifth house is all about creativity, self-esteem, creative self-expression, and for someone who works in the creative industry, it also signifies their career as an artist or creator. So therefore, I believe the Cancer ascendant makes a lot of sense. The ascendant is the lens through which someone sees the world and represents the way they approach the world as well as how others perceive them, the appearance, how they come across, what personality traits they display, especially in earlier years. Cancer is highly sensitive, and the archetype of the mother is especially prominent with this sign. Cancer has a great deal of emotional attachment to the female line of the family, the mother, but also female ancestors. Someone with a Cancer ascendant will have a tendency to withdraw from direct conflicts rather than confront someone head-on, and they can suffer greatly from emotional wounds, which then leads to physical issues such as literally swallowing their grief or pain, resulting in problems with the stomach or digestion, for example, unless they can find a way to externalize these emotions. Otherwise, they can form unhealthy attachments to food or even material objects that give them a false sense of security when their emotional needs aren't met. What Cancer people long for the most is a sense of emotional safety and nurturing. Marina had a very painful and traumatic relationship with her mother, who was extremely strict and repressive, something particularly hard to deal with for a hypersensitive child that Marina no doubt was, being highly self-conscious and feeling ugly, as she herself has stated in interviews. Her mother is represented by the moon, the ruler of Cancer, and here we see the emotional distance represented by the moon in Aquarius. This doesn't generally mean that one's mother is a very cold person. It only signifies that the relationship is somewhat unusual and lacks closeness, which can also be found in people's charts who have lost their mother at a young age, for example, or whose mother was rarely home for whatever reason, or who were raised by relatives. Marina was indeed raised by her grandparents until the age of 6, and her mother made life for her an ordeal by being absurdly strict and demanding from her already grown daughter to be home by 10 p.m., thereby making it impossible for her to have a normal social, let alone dating life at over 20 years of age. She would also beat her children and had a bad relationship with Marina's father, especially with the moon in the highly intense 8th house, representing not only the mother but also one's own emotions and instincts. There is clearly a great deal of repression, sadness, and being a loner. This house is referred to as the house of death, secrets, and sorrows. Somebody whose self-expression has been repressed is going to either become openly rebellious or will develop a highly complex inner world. However, for Marina, it wasn't for escaping into a fantasy realm, but more for cultivating her art in an almost alchemical way. This is emphasized by her personal planets, Mercury and Venus retrograde in Scorpio, that are more introverted and thus more powerful than in direct motion. Despite her mother's extremely oppressive presence in her life, Marina managed to become a renowned artist by working on her performances with painstaking and painful dedication. She often subjected herself to extreme physical and mental ordeals during her performances and lost consciousness more than once, and thus put herself into real danger. This tendency for self-sacrifice is very scorpionic, as this sign has a huge capacity for suffering suffering, which is emphasized by the planets in Scorpio. Venus retrograde and Mercury retrograde both signify introversion and inhibition with outward self-expression and self-esteem, but they also show a great intensity on the sexual as well as mental level that is only amplified by Jupiter, the planet known for heightening any influence for good or bad. Jupiter, also denoting spirituality in Scorpio, tells me that she can find fulfillment on a spiritual level from using her internalized Scorpio themes for artistic expression. Additionally, these placements show me an extremely tough woman with a high level of restraint and discipline, but she also has empathy and a sense of loyalty to the point of putting her own well-being behind that of someone she cares about. Her love can be highly passionate, but more on an internal than an outwardly dramatic level. Although with the square between the Leo and Scorpio planets, there could be some occasional drama due to the quite literal meeting of fire and water represented by the fire sign Leo and the water sign Scorpio. Both signs are fixed, which means that there's an element of stubbornness too. There's an additional aspect that gives us a glimpse into her emotional life. The square between Chiron in Scorpio and the moon shows that there is a level of profound sadness in relation to a painful theme within her family or ancestral home, as Chiron is located in the fourth house, whose themes are home, ancestry, and also home country. As the moon's symbolism goes beyond the mother archetype, this is an indication for a deep wound connected to the loss of her home country, Yugoslavia. She has mentioned in interviews that she has a deep attachment to Yugoslavia, her beloved home country. Marina's emotional landscape is marked by an ability to be highly disciplined and to detach herself from her own identity in order to tap into a pool of collective themes, but always filtered through her own experiences. I see this as a way of trying to heal the wound that she has experienced from literally losing her ancestral country, Yugoslavia, through the means of channeling her sorrows, insecurities, and trauma into her art. The eighth house is where we can overcome grief and learn how to deal with painful secrets. Hence, this is where our potential for self-transformation lies. It is connected via a trine with Neptune in Libra in the fourth house, the house of one's family home and also ancestral country, as well as a trine to Uranus retrograde conjunct the North Node in Gemini in the 11th house, which is the house of friends, life ideals, but also society in general. A trine is a supportive aspect that modern astrologers tend to regard as always positive. However, the question is, what exactly does this aspect support? A trine could very well facilitate addictive or violent tendencies, for example. By the way, I do not see such tendencies in this chart at all. On the contrary, I recognize a strong tendency to punish herself rather than lash out at others. The aforementioned placements indicate an overthrowing of social structures in the case of Uranus and deception or loss of reality with Neptune, which checks out because her home country and therefore her familiar social structures were literally dissolved, which is an important Neptunian theme. Neptune, relatively close to the IC, which is the fourth house cusp, also indicates serious issues in the family home, such as addiction or abuse. Her North Node in Gemini tells me that she has an innate need for communication and is probably drawn to teaching and exchanging ideas. With a grand trine in air signs, demarcated by the planets in Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, Marina's life is dominated by ethereal and intellectual themes. In fact, she's hyper-rational, but emotionally highly intense as well, because of her Scorpio planets, and she can have a temper and most definitely is very strong-willed. The downside of this ethereal, intellectual, and artistic grand trine is that she can tend to be too much in her own head and forgets to nurture her body. She may not be totally comfortable in her own body and could be prone to being too demanding of it and not sympathetic enough towards it. The fact that she has been cutting and otherwise tormenting her body for the sake of her art is unsurprising given the Scorpio placements. With a square between the moon in the 8th and the planets in Scorpio in the 5th house, her profound emotional landscape is in a tense and constantly challenging dialogue with her ability to trust, to explore her sexuality and the dark, secretive, underworldly femininity in the sense that one must go into the underworld in order to find one's higher self-expression, much like the mythological goddesses who had to go through trials in some chthonic realm. Venus retrograde especially hints at repressed femininity and a lack of confidence in her beauty and appeal as a woman, especially in Scorpio, which is very prone to self-doubt. Furthermore, Mercury retrograde is also part of this dialogue, which means that Marina's mind works in ways that might not be understandable or relatable to others, and she has learned to keep her innermost thoughts and feelings to herself, as her mother never met them with any compassion, understanding, or even tolerance. Jupiter in Scorpio, however, creates a huge creative strength and also toughness. Scorpio, mainly associated with the darker realms of sexuality, is primarily about self-preservation, with its traditional ruling planet Mars being the embodiment of the warrior archetype. On the flip side, Jupiter also amplifies her tendency to torment and even sacrifice herself for art and for love. Scorpio's ruler Mars is the ruler of Aries as well, the sign on the cusp of her 10th house, the house of career and public image. This means that her outward personality and career are very much a solo path, in the form of a fierce leader who won't be put into someone else's service. Her career is also of a distinctly spiritual nature, as Mars is in Sagittarius, which represents spirituality. The theme of spirituality is repeated in her 9th house, which deals with personal beliefs as well as spiritual beliefs, the cusp of which is Pisces, which is the most transcendental sign where the boundaries between the self and the collective tend to dissolve. Pisces' traditional ruler is Jupiter, linking the scorpionic realm of sex, death, and transformation in a physical and metaphorical sense with the spiritual. The father is represented by Saturn and the Sun. With Saturn retrograde in Leo, conjunct Pluto retrograde, I get the sense that her father was extremely dominant, for better or worse, but did not provide her with a great deal of stability as Saturn is retrograde, which indicates the reversal of the otherwise stable and dependable Saturnian qualities. With Pluto in Leo, it could also mean that her father had quite the temper. With the Sun in the mutable fire sign Sagittarius, we have another sign of a lack of stability and potentially eruptive violence, because Sagittarius' fiery temperament and thirst for expansion, especially combined with Mars presence, can be all-consuming, meaning that even when there might have been love or joy, there was always a lack of emotional stability and dependability, emphasizing the theme of Saturn retrograde. On a personal level, it means a karmic lesson in that Marina has to learn to assert her dominance and not allow others to impose their will upon her. Interesting to see this opposite to the moon, which makes it clear that her mother was a huge challenge in this respect. The Sun in Sagittarius is, of course, primarily representative of Marina's ego, outward personality, interests, and what she grows into during the course of her life. Sagittarius symbolizes intellectual and spiritual curiosity, and conjunct Mars, there's also a tendency towards impulsivity and a lack of filter. In other words, she is most likely very interested in spiritual themes and can be uncompromisingly blunt. I also think that this speaks of a very good sense of humor. However, her Cancer ascendant gives her a great deal of emotional sensitivity, and I also see someone who would probably rather give birth to artistic creations than children, and somebody who mostly needs intellectual stimulation in relationships. She is not a cold-hearted person, though, but she cannot abandon her naturally high intellectual sensitivity for the sake of drowning in emotions. Rather, she tries to sublimate them. This is clear not only by her Moon and Venus placement, but also in her 7th house cusp, which is Saturn-ruled Capricorn, the rest of the house being occupied by traditionally Saturn-ruled Aquarius, which tells me that she's more attracted to reserved Saturnian partners as opposed to overly dreamy romantics. On a medical astrology level, the moon in Aquarius shows a somewhat erratic energy distribution, which implies a danger of overexhaustion from intense surges of imaginative and creative power, but also potentially chronic issues with blood pressure, nervous strain, anemia, fatigue, depression, or unclear electrical disturbances in the nervous system. This could lead to being extremely sensitive to barometric pressure changes, for example. People with this placement have to regularly withdraw from the noise of the social circus in order to replenish their energy and calm their nerves. Having her sun, the life essence, in Sagittarius conjunct Mars can also mean that the nerves are easily overexcited and that she might find it hard to rest with her mind being extremely active and her awareness of her surroundings acute. In medical astrology, the 12th house governs sleep. The cusp is Gemini, which is another indicator for a potentially overactive mind that could make it hard to relax. Gemini's ruler Mercury is in Scorpio, one of the possible manifestations thereof being depression. With the rest of the house in Cancer, there is an additional risk of being unable to sleep due to digestive or stomach issues brought on by an unbalanced diet due to emotional stress or the stress manifesting in stomach issues. Another important house of health is the 6th house, which is mainly connected with physical health. And with hyperactive Sagittarius on the cusp, the ruler being in Scorpio, this could indicate issues with the sexual organs or depressive moods. Uranus and the North Node in Gemini also have to do with overactive or strained nerves and potentially lung ailments. Another hugely important health indicator is Saturn in Leo, showing a predisposition for heart trouble, potential problems with the spinal cord or blood pressure extremes, possibly of a chronic nature. Saturn also could reflect negatively on the thyroid, the throat and ears, blood, and reproductive organs. One huge overarching theme that I see in this chart is transformation and sublimation of emotionally wounding experiences into something that exceeds her own individual self and taps into societal or cultural themes that mirror her own biography, but at the same time hold a mirror to those who observe her. Because of her, I believe, higher than average intelligence, she will find herself misunderstood and more or less willfully misrepresented a lot. Decades before pop culture discovered her, Marina Abramović made a successful career and living behind the Iron Curtain initially as a renowned artist and lecturer at prestigious institutions where she has had teaching positions since the early 1970s. You don't get to teach art at such places unless you're an accomplished, renowned artist with an acclaimed public profile. And she was already an acclaimed artist decades before her massive mainstream popularity after Lady Gaga saw The Artist is Present in 2010 and introduced her work to her fans. Another thing is, of course, the continuity and the themes in her work that have been quite consistent all the time. People like Alex Jones have made a huge deal out of the spirit cooking installation and her having been invited to perform it for so-called elites. The idea began as a less than serious cookbook for spirits, inspired by the old belief that spirits can sustain themselves through intangible things like sound, light, and emotions. These instructions were intended as evocative instructions for actions or for thoughts. Examples include adding 13,000 grams of jealousy and other such absurdities. Nothing about it has any so-called satanic or human sacrificial component, and the only somewhat provocative demonstration could be seen at the Associazione per l'Arte Contemporanea in Rome, where parts of the recipes were painted in pig's blood on white canvases. But this is no more satanic than Lady Gaga's meat dress. Speaking of which, Lady Gaga is one of the main subjects of controversy and disdain within the so-called truther community, whose members more often than not come from a Christian background that loves to see everything in almost fundamentalist extremes with barely any room for nuance. They have a particularly strong penchant for irrational attachment to adopted ideas rather than opinions formed on the basis of their own independent research. Because they think Lady Gaga is evil, and because Abramović has been associated with a group of people that are very wealthy and powerful, she is automatically guilty by association in their eyes. There are other critics who have a more balanced view and who are simply bewildered or repulsed by her work because it just doesn't resonate with them, which of course is fair enough. An artist of Abramović caliber knows full well that provocation leads to attention, but she is not merely a poser, she is a creator obsessed with her work, who puts her blood, sweat and tears into it, quite literally and very obviously demonstrated in her birth chart. She also knows full well that associating with very rich, powerful people, regardless of her own opinion of them, will ultimately help her art, as has been the case with artists and wealthy patrons for centuries. On the other hand, artists such as Lady Gaga, who built her image on the merging of pop music with contemporary art, will naturally profit from associating with renowned artists such as Abramović. It's a two-way street of mutual benefit aimed at the end of the day at generating interest and moving product. Marina Abramović would be a well-established, self-sufficient artist today, even without any of the pop culture recognition. And ironically, it is precisely this mainstream prominence that has trickled down to the average internet user that put her on the radar in the first place, whereas otherwise they wouldn't even be aware of her existence because the vast majority of them hasn't the faintest interest in contemporary art, which of course is totally fine. But the fact that they seem to lack any and all interest in actually looking into the artist's work and hearing what she herself has to say, and will rather adopt a Pavlovian hive mind reaction, is more of a reflection on the people who criticize her rather than on herself. And one more thing. Just because someone criticizes the witch hunt doesn't mean they endorse or practice what the alleged witch is being accused of. Again, just because I criticize a person being accused of worshipping the devil without any hard evidence doesn't mean that I support or practice devil worship, to put it as simply as possible. My reason for saying this is that despite there being zero logic to such a conclusion, it nevertheless comes up like an automated response whenever somebody doesn't join in with the hysteria chorus. And they are almost guaranteed to find agitated commenters hurling insults at them for merely stating that maybe, just maybe, one should think for oneself instead of adopting the opinions of people whose entire media presence is built on shock value content designed to spellbind the audience for clicks, subscriptions, and revenue. I didn't have any opinion of Abramović, neither good nor bad. I am neither a fan nor a critic of her work. But after seeing her chart, I must say I do think that she is an exceptional woman with an exceptionally strong spirit. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to my channel. Until next time.